Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding. You are once again listening to PreserveCast, and today I am joined not only by an amazing guest, an amazing archaeologist and a professor, but a great friend. We're going to be talking with Kat Sterner, Dr. Katherine Sterner, I should say, at least for the introduction, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Towson University and the director of the Baltimore Community Archaeology Lab. Now, I know we've been doing a lot of Maryland episodes lately, and that's not particularly by design. It just happened to kind of play out that way. But this isn't really, as far as I'm concerned, a Maryland story. It's not a Baltimore story. This is a story about community archaeology and how impactful that can be, and all the different things that are being done in the name of archaeology and community and engagement. And I think it's an opportunity for people around the country to listen and think about ways in which they can engage in this. So I'm excited to talk with her about that. She also serves as the current president of the Council for Maryland Archaeology, and has done a whole bunch of really interesting and innovative things in her role since she's arrived at Towson. But before we get there, like everybody, we like to get to know the people that we're talking to. So, Kat, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and when you got the archaeology sort of bug.
Yeah, so I grew up all over the place. I was a Navy brat, and we moved all over the country. But by the time I was 10, my dad had retired from active service, and we retired to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which has a lot of history. And my dad was a big history buff, so I was also really interested in history. I started out my bachelor's degree at Penn State as a history major, and my first semester in undergrad, I took a introduction to anthropology course. And everybody was asking me at that time, as they do when you're a history major, what are you going to do with your degree? Teach high school history? And I was like, I don't think so. And I took this anthropology course and was really sort of enamored of the idea that you could bring all of these different fields, interdisciplinary fields, to bear on the question of what people's identity is and how they act. And there were all these different ways that you could look at these questions around people. And I really like the idea of doing these hands-on things that you could do in archaeology that I was not aware of the ability to do from a historical perspective. So I switched my major to anthropology, and that's how I got into it.
So I'm not just saying this because you're a guest today. I really do feel this way in that, like, I've worked with a lot of archaeologists, and no shame to the other archaeologists out there. We've had some on the show and everything like that. But you take a very different perspective on this. I mean, you're very interested in, like, how the public perceives archaeology. And so much of archaeology is either practiced just because it's compliance, it has to legally be done, or it kind of like it kind of happens in the shadows. It's like we don't want people to know where this site is. We can't tell anyone about this, that kind of thing. Where did your passion for engaging the public in the story come from? Was that like an early excavation that you were involved in, or was it seeing things go wrong? Like, not everybody developed this version of archaeology as sort of their guiding light. Why are you the way you are, Kat?
I think that I really love teaching. teaching has been a big part of my story since I was a third year master's student. I've been teaching other students who are only a couple of years younger than me at that time. But, it fits into my story in a lot of different places, right? So, like I said, I grew up in Gettysburg. I was playing on the battlefield. I was there with all of the tourists who were, learning these stories about the history of this place, even when I was a kid, and my dad was dragging me to all these battlefields, when we were on family vacations. And so, from a very young age, I was absorbing information about history, and sometimes I liked the way it was presented, and sometimes I didn't feel that it was very approachable. But my first archaeological field work, I did a field school. Every archaeologist has to have two things: a bachelor's degree in something close to archaeology, and a field school, which is where we learn how to do the field component of archaeology. And mine was at an 11th century castle in England. And it was a heritage site that people visited. So there were visitors on site all the time asking us about what we were doing. And I was only there for 3 weeks. But so that was kind of my first experience with being in the field, and the public was there. We were answering questions about what we were doing all the time. And then my second one, that same summer, I spent 8 weeks working for the Dayton Society of Natural History as an excavation and reconstruction intern in Dayton, Ohio. So half of my work was working on this pre-European Native American archaeological site. It's a 15th century site, doing the standard things people think archaeologists do, digging holes in the middle of a field. Nobody saw us there. But the other half was working at a reconstructed Native American village site called Sunwatch Village, where we were doing reconstruction of the structures that people had built at the site, using the same methods they had built, and in the same post holes that they had originally dug for their structures. So, and again, this is a very public site. So, I think I was, from a very early part of my career, doing public outreach and talking to the public while I was doing my archaeology. So I really didn't occur to me to do it any other way. These people were here and they were asking questions. I've done the archaeology in the middle of nowhere where there's no people around. And I've done the archaeology in a tent to keep people out because you're in the middle of an urban area excavating a cemetery, right? But I've always understood why people would be interested, and felt uncomfortable not telling people what we're up to.
Do you think, I mean, we've had someone on before from, I think it was XArch, this was years ago, like the experimental archaeology group that I think is primarily European, but maybe it's international now. But um, do you think that experimental archaeology piece was formative in that? It seems like people who do the experimental archaeology oftentimes then get really interested in like sharing that knowledge with the public. Do you feel like that was a helpful piece, and is that something you sort of encourage your students to think about? Because that's it to me, it seems like it's very helpful, but not everybody does it.
Yeah, yeah, experimental archaeology has been a big part of what I do and what I do in public settings. So my graduate work was done at University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, and a lot of the graduate students that were there were actively involved in the Wisconsin Archaeological Society, which is the mixed avocational and professional archaeological organization for the state. Um, and so early on, I got roped into being involved with them and doing public outreach at, they would do events like Archaeology Day, American Archaeology Day for the American Institute of Archaeology at the local museum, or I was being asked to give lectures as a master's student and early PhD student, public lectures because all of these different chapters of the Wisconsin Archaeological Society have monthly lectures. So but the experimental work sort of lends itself to public engagement because you're not worried about people breaking your stuff. Like they're not actual 1,000-year-old artifacts in most cases, although I do a lot of public outreach with those too. But it's stuff that you've made. And I I realized early on as I was having 7-year-olds scraping hides at a public engagement day that they had a very different idea of how to do it than I did. And I wondered where that idea came from. And I wondered whose idea should be valued more in interpreting how people did things in the past. So to me, that's a very anthropological perspective as opposed to this sort of historic perspective of, well, these are the records that we have, and this is how we've interpreted things in the past. So I think this sort of bringing multiple viewpoints in comes from that anthropological background.
So, I mean, speaking of kind of the multiple viewpoints and public engagement and things like that, your career brought you to Towson University, which is just located just north of the city of Baltimore in Baltimore County. And you, in pretty quick succession, decided you wanted to create a community archaeology lab. Did you have a sort of a prototype or a model you were basing this on, or is this a sterner original?
Let's see. I had a sort of idea of how I would fund it because when I was in graduate school, I worked for University of Wisconsin Milwaukee's Cultural Resource Management program. And most archaeologists make a living, and 95% of archaeologists in the United States make a living doing the sort of compliance end of archaeology, and that's what I did the whole way through graduate school when I wasn't teaching. So it was kind of CRM in the summers and then teaching during the semester. And then after I finished my PhD, I was doing cultural resource management full time. And so I had this model in place that I had found incredibly helpful to my career development, where I was doing hands-on real archaeology paid, that's the key component of it, while I was in graduate school. And these weren't like lame pipeline projects where you don't find anything. These were really cool sites to work on where we were answering really important questions and finding sites in places that we didn't expect to find them, like 4 feet below the streets in downtown Milwaukee. We were finding 3,000-year-old sites, and they were sort of transformative in how I thought about where we would find things. So I had all of this experience before I had finished my graduate work. And I really wanted my students to have that experience. So that was sort of one piece of the puzzle. But then the other piece that I saw was that there was a real lack of awareness of what archaeology is in the Baltimore area. This sort of void was being filled by folks who are very active, pot hunters or privy diggers or, bottle collectors. And the general public thinks that's archaeology because it's very visible and something that is accessible to them. And archaeology was not. There are lots of folks who are doing that compliance driven archaeology in this area, but there's no public outreach component to it. So I saw a real need there, but that part I did not have a map for, and nor was it something that I was trained in at all. So I staggered a little bit more on how to incorporate the public and the right way to proceed through that.
So I think it's interesting that you kind of have this experience of seeing the West, or at least the Midwest. I don't know, is Wisconsin the West or Midwest?
It's
Midwest.
Midwest,
We'll
yeah.
go with mid. It's West to us. Anything past West Virginia is West. But is you've seen archaeology from different regional perspectives, and you pointed that out, that like you felt like when you arrived in this area that there was a different sort of idea around archaeology, and obviously there's different partners, different stakeholders in archaeology in different areas. Obviously, there's different indigenous partners depending on which part of the country that you're working in, and different ways in which the public perceives it. Do you feel like there is a real difference on the East Coast versus, and in really densely compact communities in places like Maryland versus a Wisconsin, or Iowa and other places that I know you've worked at? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pieces to the answer to that. And yes, I absolutely think there is a difference. So, I'm an archaeologist who, until I worked in Maryland, had mostly worked on pre-European Native American sites. And now I do a lot of both. From a contract perspective, I work on a lot of Euro-American historic sites, and now I work on pre-contact sites here too. And so, the stakeholders are going to be different depending on the type of site that you're working on, where it's located, and that's true regardless of where you're located in the country. But there are definitely different power dynamics in the Midwest versus in the Mid-Atlantic. So in the Midwest, the Native American tribes, there are more federally recognized tribes that are present. There are tribal lands, like there are reservations in those states where the tribes own the land and are responsible for who does archaeology on the land. You're not doing archaeology on tribal land. Tribal archaeologists are doing that. And they wield a lot more political power, so they have a lot more say in what is done, what types of legislation is in place to protect indigenous ancestors and ancestral sites. So the dynamic looks different. The awareness is different. The public awareness of indigenous sites on the landscape is very different. Every middle schooler in Wisconsin knows about Native American burial mounds, right? And that there's Native Americans that live on that landscape still. I don't think the same can be said in Maryland. And that's the difference of 200 years of colonization, right? Maryland is colonized 200 years earlier. The tribes are pushed to places like Wisconsin and Iowa. And so there's this thought that those people that got pushed aren't in Maryland anymore, which is not true. A lot of them came back, and a lot of them stayed and managed to integrate into European society so that they could stay. So there's a difference in perception of who's here and who is still on the land and has power in that land. And then I think there's also a difference in how archaeology is done. I felt when I first came to Maryland that there was actually a lot more public outreach than I was used to in the Midwest. You have organizations like Archaeology in the Community and archaeologists that are sort of embedded in some of these county recreation and parks organizations. That was not something that we had in the Midwest. But I think it's these grassroots sort of public archaeology things have arisen in the Mid-Atlantic in the absence of broad state legislation and support for robust archaeology programs at the state level. So these public programs aren't here because we have more support for and awareness of archaeology. It's because there's less sort of institutional support for it. And so these sort of grassroots organizations have sprung up in response to that, I think.
So obviously, in some ways, the Community Archaeology Lab is part of that response. It's a university's kind of version of that. Talk to us about what it is. Like, what does this actually mean? How does it play out? Obviously, there's the component of students working and getting paid. There's the component of community partnership. But give us the thumbnail of what it is, and maybe give us an example of some of the things that you're proud of that it's been able to accomplish.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very young. We've only been doing this for 2 years. And by we, I mean me. So we have a staff of me, and then I have one sort of permanent staff member, full-time staff member that we hired this fall. We currently have 4 student employees and a high school intern. And all of the administrative responsibilities are mine in addition to my other professorly duties. We're in the early stages of really getting the infrastructure to support the incredible influx of projects that we've seen in the last 2 years. And some of that is due to my tenacity in pursuing projects and external funding for things like, I think one of the examples I'm most proud of right now is we got a grant from the Maryland State Department of Education in collaboration with Charles County Public Schools, the Piscataway Conoy Tribe, and St. Mary's College of Maryland to develop and implement a 3-week summer program for Indigenous middle and high schoolers in Charles County Public Schools that would be a mix of teaching them Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and archaeological methods. And so I'm in the midst of developing that curriculum with the Piscataway Conoy right now. And it's been a real eye opener for me in the way, the levels at which community archaeology can include community, right? So that's on kind of the far end of the spectrum of, we went to the Piscataway Conoy and we said, hey, can we develop a program with you that would help your youth get involved in archaeology, but also emphasize the knowledge that you wish archaeologists had as they are working on sites that are relevant to you. So I feel like that's kind of the gold standard of the most community involvement, right? They're partners from the very beginning, from the development, 1-to-1 ratio of input here. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got these sort of little one-off projects where we have community come to us. Right now I have a private homeowner who purchased her home last year and found out there is a cemetery on the property that she did not know about. The previous owner did not disclose it, and they took all the headstones and hid them in the backyard so that they didn't know that there was a cemetery there. And now she is responsible
just
for...
as an aside, that's insane.
Yeah.
But thanks for that. That's a wild story. That is not. Yeah.
There's some legal aspects of this going on right now.
I would imagine.
She's got the real estate agent in court. But on the side now, she really wants to do the right thing with this cemetery and take care of it. She's also interested potentially in pursuing, disinterment and moving the interments to a different locations that's not, it's literally the graves abutted her patio. Like there's maybe a foot between the first grave and the patio. So maybe not the best place to have a cemetery. So I just went out there and did a ground penetrating radar survey to figure out where they are. And now we're doing a archival search to figure out, is this a family plot? When was it in use? All of those sorts of questions, right? So this is, I think, still community archaeology. It's a community member that came to us with a need, And, we're just kind of providing a service in this case, right? It's less collaborative, it's less sort of ground up, but it's still filling a community need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, can you imagine getting yourself in that situation? I mean, I kind of laid it on thick to say it's sort of an insane situation, but that is really, I mean, would be shocking to find something like that on your property. And who do you turn to? And in this case, fortunately, there's a community archaeology lab where at least they can talk to you about your options. And fortunate that you have a homeowner who is so concerned about sort of the appropriate approach to all of this and sort of the sanctity of a final resting place. That sounds like a whole other podcast unto itself. Once the dust dries and the ink dries and the dust settles, I should say. So, I mean, a way that we've been engaged, obviously a lot of people listening know that Preservation Maryland powers PreserveCast. And one of the ways that Preservation Maryland has had the opportunity to be engaged is through several summits that you've put on for archaeologists and the indigenous community. And I feel like those were really impactful for me. It's been interesting to be in an event where I don't have to have a speaking role. I just get to sit back and kind of listen and be a sponsor and a partner, but really get to hear people. And I think it's been really powerful and impactful stuff to get people in the same room and allow them to hear each other. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that that's also a role that preservation organizations and groups and museums and folks that are listening to this podcast could think about potentially replicating in their own community.
Yeah, I think, it's important to understand the history of community archaeology and what sort of like movements it grew out of, right? So what we call community archaeology today started out as public archaeology, which is sort of what I was doing in graduate school, which is sort of bringing archaeology to the public, but not really embedding yourself in the community and serving community interests as a primary function. It grew out of this broader perspective that is now we call decolonizing or decolonial archaeology, and you are recognizing that archaeology has played a significant role in um, developing the perspectives that people are learning about in school, right? Because most of us, a lot of people only learn about the history of the place that they're on when they're in their social studies classrooms. And those narratives are put together by the research that historians and archaeologists do. And those narratives have been very Western in their interpretations of how things happened and how we think about the landscape and how we think about the way that people are connected to the landscape. One of the activities that we're developing I've got curriculum on the mind as we're developing this summer program. We had a curriculum committee meeting yesterday, and we're looking at maps that the Piscataway have drawn of their homelands in comparison to maps that are available all over the internet from different sources about how they have mapped their homelands, right? And you've got very different perspectives there. So I think as an academic, you don't go into academia unless you've got some ego, right? I don't know any academics who don't have some ego. And that makes it difficult to relinquish control of the narratives that we are producing as researchers, as intellectuals, as academics, and so as teachers. And working with the Indigenous community in Maryland has really been an opportunity to loosen that grip on control of the narrative, and recognize that there are other perspectives that should be heard and are often not heard, not just indirectly because of archaeology, but directly because we credential professionals that say, this is the way that I know things to be, and this is the proper way to learn about things. And thus, my viewpoint is correct, and we shouldn't listen to all of these other perspectives. So I think the summits have been a way for me to try to give back in a way that is useful, right? To make archaeology something that is useful to the indigenous community, that is helpful, not harmful, right? So go beyond do no harm to the next level of let's be helpful, and not in a way that is paternalistic, but asking people, what do they really want? What would be helpful for you? And how can the archaeological community help with that?
Yeah, I think the thing that's been interesting for me, and like maybe a lesson for not just the programming that we've been able to sponsor through a summit like that, but also just sort of our own programming, and maybe a lesson for people listening, is that while content is important, and it's this sort of rich for me to say this as I'm creating content, but as as important as content is, it's not the content of the summits that's been the most important for me. It's been hearing from different people. It's sort of a means to an end. It's a way to get people in the room to hear about different things, and it's been interesting. And there's been really great topics brought up and things like that. But I think it's also just leaving space for people to hear each other, and to understand where people are coming from. And the first time all the people were brought together in the room, it was sort of cathartic. There was a lot that came out because those communities hadn't been talking to each other directly in a place like that. There had been one-offs and some really good exchanges, but not just sort of a structured exchange like that. And that was just really interesting for me, as a preservationist, to hear that, as someone who is archaeology adjacent, but not an archaeologist, to be able to be in that space and to hear that and think about ways that we can be supportive of that as a more traditional historic preservation group. Um, for someone listening who's like, okay, this is awesome, but I live in Iowa, or I live in Georgia. I want to do this, but where is mine? Is there like an association of community archaeologists? Is this a growing movement? Where do people find out about this? Or maybe there's a professor listening and is like, I want to do this. How come I can't do this? How do they do it? Do you have a manual now, Kat?
I do not have a manual. In fact, I just brought on a new graduate assistant to help do our public outreach, and I sent her these embarrassingly disorganized folders, digital folders, because I'm the only one that's putting stuff in them. So I know where everything is, right? When you're the only one doing stuff, you're not really organizing it very well because you know where it is, right? But when other people have to find it, all of a sudden, you have to be a little more structured. So I think there's been a very organic, is a nice way of putting it, growth of this program. And I guess there's a couple different components to the advice I would give. There is a conference on public archaeology. We held the second one this past August. It was in Washington, D.C. So it's every other year. So we don't have a location for it yet. The next time it will be, so it will be in 2027. But I found that really valuable. So it's not paper presentations. It's all panels and workshops. So very focused on, spreading knowledge about what people are doing, what people are working on. So I think that's a good practitioner community that people can get into. The Society for American Archaeology has an interest group on community engaged heritage practices, so people are having these conversations. There's a lot of good books that have come out recently around sort of public archaeology and community archaeology. Um, And I would also say, being connected to the avocational group, every state has a group of avocational and professional archaeologists that work together. In Maryland, it's the Archaeological Society of Maryland. In Wisconsin, it was the Wisconsin Archaeological Society. In Pennsylvania, it's the Society for Pennsylvania Archaeologists. And you don't have to be a professional archaeologist to join. So that was certainly how I got my start in being involved with the public, was doing all of this outreach as part of the avocational professional group together. So definitely start there, right? Use those resources that are already in place. But be prepared to make mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes. I called this the Baltimore Community Archaeology Lab immediately, when it first started, but I really had no idea how to engage with the community. I'd only been a part of the community for 3 years. I'd only been living in Baltimore for 2 years. And it's not like I was really embedded in this community and getting to know it. I feel a lot more comfortable now than I did then. And that's because I made a lot of mistakes and was corrected. We haven't gotten enough reports from you. You haven't done enough community outreach events. We feel like you're taking the lead and not involving us enough. So avoid as many of those mistakes as you can and really get as many community partners involved as early as you can. But I think also recognizing that your projects will exist on this sliding scale of community involvement, right? Which is what I mentioned earlier. So some projects will be very, very community involved, and others will not. And you're not always going to guess right as to how much people want to be involved in the process. And so you have to seek that feedback as much as possible and be prepared to be rebuked and fix it and repair. And I think that's what makes community archaeology different, is seeking that feedback and then responding to it and being comfortable with that.
It's almost like in some ways that the skill set for it is as much about community organizing and engagement and partnership building as it is about the actual physical work of archaeology. And I feel like that's why and it's no secret here that we're a partner at Preservation Maryland of the Community Archaeology Lab laboratory, and it makes total sense that we are. But I think that that's why it's been seamless for us to get engaged, because even though we may not have the expertise around the physical act of archaeology, and all the science associated with that, we do have experience working with the public and engaging and in partnerships and fundraising and all those sorts of things. And the reason I say that is not like a pat on the back for us, but it's for other organizations listening that might be thinking about, well, maybe I should be involved in this. Yeah, there probably is a place for you, even if you're not pure archaeologists, right? Like, I think that there's a way for different people to get engaged, and that's the whole point of this. But I think that it's important for organizations and institutions to hear this as well. And I know there's a lot of listeners with those sorts of backgrounds here listening to PreserveCast.
Yeah, I would absolutely, add that the Baltimore Community Archaeology Lab would not have come together without partnerships like with Preservation Maryland, because I had a career in cultural resource management and academic archaeology, where they teach you nothing about community organizing and public engagement and fundraising. And, so I learned a lot from working with partners like you guys. And I think that the idea that you can put something together like this on your own is not a good idea. Because it's not going to be a community enterprise then. And the first thing that I did when I had the idea about making this lab was to reach out to all of the preservation organizations that I could find, the professional archaeologists that I could find in Baltimore, and be like, hey, does it seem like you guys would want something like this? And I was completely surprised when everybody was like, yeah, I think we really do. And I was like, really? Nobody's going to be mad if I make this thing. And there was really unilateral support for uniform support for this across the board from folks that said, yes, this is something that we need. And so I think incorporating ways for those external groups to be involved consistently, not just as a one-off when you're getting started, but continuing to maintain those partnerships is really important, so you don't get too stuck inside the academic shell of what we're doing at the university, which is easy to do. Uh, keeping that toe outside with those other organizations, I think, helps me be more aware of uh, what's going on, and I think helps you guys be more aware of what's going on in the archaeological community.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it in this case the lab is with a university, and it anchors us into what's going on with students and have the opportunity to engage with them, because it's very easy to quickly forget what that's all like and what that's all about and what the needs are over there unless you're routinely engaged with it. A little bit of a pivot as we kind of draw to a conclusion here. It's the 250th anniversary of the nation this July. Obviously, archaeology looks at a much larger slice of human history than just the last 250 years. But what is the not to put you on the spot to speak as on behalf of the archaeology community? I know that that's not your role, but like, where is the lab, for example, in thinking about the 250th? Is this an opportunity to engage more people? Obviously, 1976 was a big moment for public archaeology, but how do you see this playing out, and what's your hope for the 250th?
Yeah, so as the president of the Council for Maryland Archaeology, I can kind of put that hat on for a second. I'm part of the planning of our yearly Maryland Archaeology Month. Every year we do Maryland Archaeology Month, and right now we're coming up with a theme. The theme's going to be around the 250th, of course, and we got to come up with a tagline, right? So the voting is ongoing. I don't want to disclose anything too early here, but I don't know that our listeners will freak out too much. We've got something going around about many voices, right? And I think that recognizing that there are a lot of voices in how we remember the 250th is a huge part of what I'd like to highlight, and that there are different ways of remembering that moment in history, the moments that lead up to it, the moments that follow, and really trying to accommodate a variety of perspectives on that that maybe we don't always hear. And I think, what can archaeology contribute to those memories of 1776, right? So we have the history book version, which comes a lot from written records, and then archaeologists deal somewhat in written records, but we're also dealing with the stuff that people have, right? And the written record of what I do on a daily basis probably tells you something different than all the stuff that's in my office right now. So I think that we can use those archaeological materials to really add some nuance to the story of what this did to people's lives, daily lives.
Yeah, no, I love that. And actually, I mean, I know we're talking about the 250th, but just for somebody listening, sitting in their car right now or going for a walk, like, think about that. Like, what would the written version of you tell, and what would the version of you physically tell? Like, what's on your what's on your body right now, or within arm's reach, and what would that tell you about yourself? I'm sure that that's like a standard, archaeology 101 activity in a classroom, but sort of a fun little thing to think about. Before we go, favorite historic place or site?
And I should have prepared better for this. I think that I have to go with Gettysburg. And specifically at Gettysburg is Devil's Den. And Devil's Den, which I'm sure you're aware of, Nick, given your history with Gettysburg, is this huge pile of boulders. I learned in my 9th grade geology class that they're igneous rocks. That's the only thing I remember from that class. And that when I was a kid, I spent loads of time. I loved climbing through these caves and climbing up on the rocks. And right next to Devil's Den is a stream that runs through called the Slaughter Pen. And it is a nice little stream that dozens of men died in. There's a reason it's called the Slaughter Pen. And I think that maybe that recognition early in my adult life, that there was a very dual understanding of that place for me, where I was playing on these rocks and in the slaughter pen. And there were signs, around there showing a picture of one of the soldiers who had died over top of this hill. Really gave me this perspective on how people can have multiple understandings of a place and multiple associations with a place, right? So when I go there now as an adult, I appreciate the natural beauty of the place. I appreciate the sort of solemnity with which it should be regarded, because it's a place where lots of people died and had horrific experiences. And I have these childhood memories too of, playing in these places, the dark cave that we didn't want to crawl through because it was too scary. So I think that that's a place that has a lot of pieces for me, both personal and professional. And I've never gotten to work as an archaeologist there, but I have a lot of thoughts about what it would be like too, and what sort of questions I would ask. It's a really important site to me.
Yeah, no, I love that answer. What a great place. And I think time and time we come back to this idea here that layers of history make things just more interesting, more fascinated, certainly more complicated, but people are drawn to the layers and to understanding where they fall within those layers too. And couldn't probably pick a better place than a place where there are physically big layers in the place itself. Kat, this has been great. We will make sure that there's a link in the show notes to Kat's information about the Baltimore Community Archaeology Lab and Towson University. And if you want to become one of our students, you can figure out how to do that there. It's been great having you here. Look forward to having you back and talking about a future project when you have one right here on PreserveCast.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
PreserveCast is recorded in Maryland and is powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2017, the podcast has told stories from around the world about how people are documenting, caring for, and interpreting the past. If you want to support this effort, please visit preservecast.org to learn more and keep on preserving.